Alright, so after last time when I was reading you a script and trying to get fancy with the editing and realizing that just wasn't me, I'm going to just pretend like I'm in front of you guys and I'm giving you the usual classroom lectures. We're going to move away from the kind of dark and depressing topic. We're going to move to the happier version of this conversation, which is about all the people who recognized at the time the kind of evils that were being done. They were called abolitionists. Abolitionists were the people who supported the dismantling of slavery. There were a lot of people who saw slavery and realized this is not an okay thing for us to be doing to other human beings. So here are the three things we're going to cover in this video. I'm going to talk quickly about racism then versus racism now, and how things that are racist now have always been racist but kind of flew under the radar due to bigger problems. We're also going to talk about the role of religion, specifically Christianity, on both sides of the slavery argument. And then I've got a call to action at the end. Martin Luther King Jr. has this pretty famous quote. You might have heard it before. If not, you will definitely hear it again. The arc of history bends toward justice, is what he says. So what Martin Luther King Jr. meant by that is that little by little, as difficult as it seems, with the exception of probably the Dark Ages, humanity has been growing and getting more just, meaning more good, more fair to each other. Racism today plays out like making someone feel unsafe or unwanted, and oftentimes it results in biases that keep people from getting good jobs, or living in nice neighborhoods, or getting into the better college, or getting arrested at higher rates. That's what racism really looks like today. It also has unfortunately lately led to some actual old-fashioned hate crimes. In 2018, hate crimes reached their highest point since the years after 9/11. There's still a lot of progress to be done, a lot of work to be done, but we've made progress since the early 1800s. In the early 1800s, according to our standards, almost everyone was racist. We would have called them all racists. Even the ones that turned out to be heroes in this part of the story were racist. We'll get to that in a second. So when the major problems were that African Americans were being beaten and raped and killed and enslaved, most people didn't worry about the use of a derogatory term or wearing blackface. So I want to be clear, these things are racist, and we don't condone that. But back when black people were literally being enslaved and beaten and killed and raped, people who were against those things didn't see a problem with using the N-word or wearing blackface or telling black people they can't drink out of the same water fountains. They had a line drawn there in that area that we today would still say, no, that's still not okay. Don't do that. Even most of the abolitionists at that time, they believed that once slaves were freed, they should be sent back to Africa. Most of them believed that. They didn't want African Americans to intermingle with their white communities. That should sound familiar. There were a lot of people, actually, who, a lot of African Americans who believed and agreed with that. They said, yeah, once we're free, I do want to go back to Africa. That's where my ancestors came from. That's where, people look like me and I'm welcome. One of those people, he lived after the Civil War, but he led one of the bigger movements about this. His name was Marcus Garvey, and he believed that African Americans should move back to Africa. There is one country in Africa called Liberia that was actually started by freed slaves from the United States, and they went over to Liberia and they started a new country. A lot of people speak English there. It's got a really interesting history, and it's linked to that idea that once the slaves were freed, they should go back to Africa. Now, today, if we, if someone says go back to Africa, that is a very racist thing to say, obviously. I'm just trying to draw a line between the ideas back then of what was considered unacceptable to talk about and what we know now is unacceptable. That idea of separating the whites from the blacks should sound familiar. It's something we talked about, and it's something that even came up it was your vocab word actually in your textbook assignment, segregation. Keeping races separate is called segregation. After the Civil War, when the slaves were freed, especially states in the South passed laws to keep blacks and whites apart from each other. This is the major thing that Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. were fighting against in the 1960s. That is 100 years after the Civil War. So be aware that for 100 years after slaves were freed, they were still kept in a part of society that was like other or different, and not given the same rights as everyone else. Okay, the second thing we're going to talk about is how Christianity was used by both sides. One of these things I'm going to say should look familiar to anybody who did the DBQ last week. There was a quote in there by this guy, the South Carolina governor named George McDuffie, quite a name, and his argument was God wants all these black people to be slaves. He said, "No human institution, in my opinion, is more clearly consistent with the will of God than slavery." There's this letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to people in Ephesus, which is an area of modern-day Turkey or Greece around there. It says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ." So this looks like Paul is saying that slaves should obey their masters, right? He's not saying slavery is a good thing, but he's saying if you are a slave, you should obey your master. Early Christians, who Paul was, the guy writing this, they focused a lot on just keeping the peace until Jesus came back. They all believed that Jesus would come back like right away. So they were saying, no, we shouldn't have to fight slavery or anything because the world's going to end any time now. I want to point out that they often would not include the second part. Masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no favoritism with him. So that second part shows that it's talking about God in heaven, of course. It shows that that God has no favoritism between slave or master. They would not include that part because it doesn't feed the narrative, right? The slavery Apostle Paul would have been referring to is not the same kind of slavery we're talking about. It's not chattel slavery, which didn't really exist in those days. These were slaves. They were like either captured prisoners or they were debtors, people who owed money to their masters. And these were people who could eventually earn their freedom back if they behaved well or if they paid back their money, that sort of thing. These are not people who are being treated like animals. Frederick Douglass says, "Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive one as good, pure, and holy is, of necessity, to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ." I want to pause there. So he says impartial Christianity of Christ. Impartial means not having favoritism. That goes back to that verse where it says that God in heaven has no favoritism. And then he says, "I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land." So here he's talking about the people who are promoting slavery. He's saying that their Christianity is totally different from the Christianity he believes in. And so this is the whole point I wanted to draw, is that at this time, and still, honestly, throughout history and to this day, there are different views of Christianity and all religions. And they in this specific scenario with slavery, both views play a really strong part in the battle between slavers and abolitionists. Not only was Christianity used to back up slavery, it was used to tear down slavery. So a huge religious movement called the Second Great Awakening. This came about in the early 1800s, and these people believed that all people were created equal. They encouraged people to take ownership of their faith, and people actually started to read the Bible for themselves. So that was problematic for racist preachers and the slavers who followed them, who were spreading false narratives to keep the slaves under control. Once people got in there and they read these verses that people were giving them, they realized they were twisting the words and they were not being honest about them. So a bunch of Methodists and Baptists and these Second Great Awakening people became vehemently opposed to slavery. Anti-slavery activism relied on the conviction that all people were made in God's image and precious in his sight. God was the father of all mankind, and all nations were his offspring of one blood. So this would be the argument that John Wesley and Charles Spurgeon would be making, that everybody is equal and everybody deserves the same rights.